All right. So last presentation of the whole conference, I promised lots of pictures. So when Guru asked me to do this, thanks again, Guru, the context was to give all of you some perspective on how the VC industry is currently viewing SDN and OpenFlow and the whole idea. So, I figured I'd cover 4 things in the 10 minutes. Just give you a quick background on myself, talk a little bit about the current dynamics, some of the players and some of the recent activity in virtualized networking, and then just some parting opinions. So a little personal history, not because I think it's particularly exciting or despite my profession, you might be surprised, I actually don't really enjoy talking about myself. I just think it will give you some context about why I've been involved in this sector. So I grew up in Atlanta. I went to Harvard and studied math and computer science, economics. Had a very unglamorous career as a professional soccer player. Went to University of Chicago and had the fortune of studying distributed systems and what they called grid computing, now cloud, in the 90s. I came out to California to start a company with some guys that's in the financial services tech space. It's about 800 people today and going strong. And I ended up at Stanford Business School where I actually met Martine and Nick about 8 years ago. From there, I went to a startup that VMware acquired shortly thereafter, and with some reluctance, I actually joined the venture community, where I've been focused primarily on data center infrastructure for the past 6 years. And that's me without the shark's beard and my wife and my daughter Faith. So as an entrepreneur, I had 2 biases about venture capitalists before I became one. The first was I found that a lot of them had these big egos and they sort of thought of themselves like this, but the reality is they kind of look like that. And the second was there wasn't a lot of original thought coming out of the business, or the people I had met at least, that they were herd-like, or I think people referred to them as lemmings. Turns out 6 years later I was pretty right about both those things. But I wanted to give you an example, just so you're not just hearing my opinions. But I think by now people have heard of big data. It's a pretty hot idea. And I thought this was an interesting graph for people to look at because it's the cumulative dollars into the industry. And as you can see, it starts pretty small with a trickle, and then inflows get exponential. The VCs sort of flow in at some mass at some tipping point. Another way to think about this is the Gartner hype cycle, right? It's people are pretty familiar with this, and not to scare any of you non-math people off, but think of this as the derivative of that cumulative funding history curve, right? Where as visibility grows, VCs first trickle in, and then they flood. And then as a space is overfunded, or it takes time for the market to adopt the new technology in a meaningful way, the pace of funding goes way down. However, if you were to measure value, and so for you calculus fans, the integral of this curve, it would actually eventually be positive. And so the interesting debate is it negative within some range, because the overfunded companies, the losers in essence, die off before the winners actually create meaningful value. But that's for a different time. So then I wanted to, what about SDN? Kind of where are we in that same lens? And so I actually think we're relatively early in the curve. We're LightSpeed, where I'm at, we've been investing for a few years now, but it's not exactly a secret anymore. My feeling is that eventually the VC herd is going to come running this way too. The market's just too big, and what's happening is too disruptive. Since this is meant to give you some perspective on the industry at large, I thought it might be helpful to try to categorize essentially why the escalation happens in a given sector, and then how that applies to where we are in SDN currently. So I really don't want to offend anyone. I don't mean to equate terrorism or war to VC funding patterns, but I wanted to use a scale that was familiar to people, and so this is sort of the DEFCON threat matrix the US government uses. So the column on the left is, I called it VC readiness condition as opposed to defense readiness condition. So I borrowed that, yeah. And the status quo is really academic research, right? It's going on all the time, and there's smart people, trying to solve hard problems. And then, what happens next is essentially a few cutting-edge enterprises seeking to solve particular business problems no one's ever had to solve before. They get interested. So that might ring some bells. And then this is historically where a few VCs, sometimes with particular knowledge of an industry, do some initial investing. And then step 3 is, when the broader technical community starts to see the potential for how powerful the disruption is, and they consider ways it may apply to the mass market. This is where the new use cases are starting to get clarified, and things like conferences are held, where mostly a technical audience is present. And then things start to heat up when the value proposition for the mass market can be clearly articulated and the opportunity is understood, both by investors and the end customers. And then if that doesn't do it, usually one of the leaders in the industry gets bought, or there's an IPO, and then that guy's back with his bag of money. So today I'd say, I think we're graduating from level 4 to level 3. That's kind of where we are in the life cycle, if one person's opinion. Why aren't we at 2 or 1 yet? So there's 2 macro points here. The idea that what happened sort of at the end of 2008, it's affected the VC industry. So if you look at just inflows into the business, it used to be about $30 billion a year. Last year and the 3 years before that, it was half that amount. So there's just fewer dollars going, available. The second part is that there's actually a lot fewer VCs than there used to be focusing on data center infrastructure, enterprise infrastructure. Remember how I was telling you about that herd mentality? Well, it turns out that a $100 billion valuation for Facebook or $1 billion for Instagram in 18 months, it attracts the herd. And so they look elsewhere, and this has sort of been neglected. So that's definitely something to consider. But more importantly, I think, for this audience is that the micro point, which is that the VCs that I talk to, and they have this annoying habit of wanting to go to coffee all the time. In some of the startups, I think they're missing, the key point. So VCs and investors in general, right? They get economics, they get financial numbers, and so a lot of them are talking about the supply chain economic benefit, or essentially the same protocol soup that network's always been, just cheaper. And that's not what this is about. And so I hear glimmers of that now. It's great, but what it is about, and I think as soon as people realize this, is when you'll see the herd running. Is today's networking solutions don't solve today's problems optimally, right? And so we've heard a lot about that. And whether it's virtualization any-to-any, or big data clusters, or cloud computing, or storage tiers with different performance characteristics, there's a better way to do that, right? And so when you hear Nick or Scott talk about how they teach protocols and every other professor teaches principles, and people talking about bringing networking out of the dark ages into the modern era, that, to me, that's the insight that actually is going to flip the investor community this way in a hurry. And so it's about speed. The hardware innovation curve is a lot less interesting than the software one. And so networking has been stuck in a gear that other pieces of the data center infrastructure have not. And that's what SDN is all about. So I'll end just with a couple points, which is at LightSpeed, I'm not saying we're a bunch of smarty pants. We're not. You probably already figured that out by now. But the firm's been investing in networking for a couple decades, and so, when you do that, you have a history that helps you see the through lines a little more easily. And then when you're in the sector, one of the advantages you have is that that constant contact with customer means you're learning faster than everyone else. And so, at the end of the day, I think we're in the early innings of this massive disruption, and there's tremendous opportunity ahead for startups. Which, don't tell my competitors. And so anyway, there's a big team at LightSpeed that works on this. I'm just one person part of it, and we're really actively looking for more. So if you got ideas, come talk to us. All right.